Before we get to our interview with John, just a reminder to rate and review the show on your podcast app and support us on Patreon Hidden Truth Show. Okay, here's our interview with John O'Neill. So let's talk about the war in Ukraine. I've been covering it for the show. I also have a personal connection. My wife's mother and grandmother live in Kiev. So we've been living it pretty personally here every day. Fortunately, things are looking a little bit better. But one thing I've been intrigued by that we haven't heard as much about of late, but we heard about a lot at the outset, was these bio labs in Ukraine that are supposedly old Soviet labs that the U.S. has some relationship to, has been funding or what have you. So tell me what you know about these labs.
All right. You need to understand sort of first where they came from. Joseph Stalin began what are called Litter-Noy killings. Litter-Noy killings were liquidations that looked like people were dying naturally. He used anthrax. And so, like in our book, Pavlova died of pneumonia, but it wasn't pneumonia, it was anthrax. And he killed a lot of people exactly like that. Well, having killed people like that, he decided to go on a big scale, and he started bioweapons laboratories in a number of locations. One of them was in Kiev. The big ones were in Saratov in the Soviet Union and out in the Urals, and one poison lab in Moscow itself called Lab 1. The one in Saratov leaked in 1939, almost killed Stalin. Stalin called the guy in from Saratov. He was at the hotel in Moscow, and he started coughing. And so they brought a doctor, and the doctor said, "My God, you've got pneumonic plague. We haven't seen pneumonic plague in Moscow in 300 years." And so they isolated him. The people in contact with him all died. And they closed the hotel down, claimed it was a plumbing failure. But he came within an hour or two of wiping out the whole leadership of the Soviet Union. That was the first big league. In 1972 in Kiev, the city that your friends are in, a biolab operated by the Soviet Union, biowar lab, leaked into the sanitary water system, into the rats in the sanitary water system, leaked anthrax and produced a form of anthrax called anthrax 638. Through mutation, which is still used by the Soviet Union. In 1979, in the Urals at Ekaterinburg, there was a disaster, a genuine disaster. A plume of anthrax went a long way, killed at least 1,000 people. The Soviets at that time claimed it was due to tainted meat in a meat market. They shot dogs and tried to butcher, but it was an anthrax leak. At the same time, there was a leak in China in 1977. Talking about, for just a second, about the Ukraine, because it's a terrible false flag story. What really happened is when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States went in and provided money to both the Ukraine and the Soviet Union to clean up these terrible biowar labs and get rid of the contents of them. Understand, they have smallpox. The only smallpox on Earth is in a Soviet lab and in a Chinese lab. They have other terrible deals, so getting rid of them is no small item. In the Ukraine, that's exactly what they did. And they took the biowar labs that they had and turned them into biolabs. Now, Jim, biolabs are a great thing. That's where when somebody takes your blood, they analyze it. There are 40,000 biolabs in the United States. What we don't have are biowar labs. And so the biolabs in Kiev and other places were all converted into normal biolabs used by pharmaceutical companies and used for testing. In the Soviet Union, according to the Wall Street Journal in 2000, 2001, as soon as Putin came in, he took the money we were giving to clean them up and devoted it to bioweapons. And so he re-energized their entire bioweapons program. There's a good book by a man named Kenneth Albrecht, a defector, who tells you the story of this. And the Soviet Union, Russia, has the largest bioweapons program on Earth right now. China is number 2. They have 14 bioweapons labs. Putin bragged in 2012 in the presidential debate about his bioweapons, and he shut off all the inspections required under a treaty that everyone in the world signed in 1972 in 2014. And that's why people in the Ukraine are afraid, as they genuinely should be, about the possibility of his use of chemical and biological war. In Mariupol, the Marines have claimed, as you know, that the Russians are using chemical weapons.
When did the U.S. stop funding the cleanup of the labs in Russia? I'm curious.
As soon as we learned that the money had been diverted, we stopped all funding. That was roughly 2001. What happened is the guy that was supposedly in charge of the cleanup, he became exposed. There was a big article in the Wall Street Journal, and so Putin announced he was firing him. Yes, he fired him from being in charge of the cleanup, and he placed him in charge of the entire pharmaceutical industry of Russia. That was how he was fired. And he's still there right now. You can look all about him. He lives, interestingly, in Tsar Village, TSAR Village, which is an interesting place, isn't it, for an official to live?
Right. So back to the Ukraine lab, because again, it came up as a part of, after the invasion, and there was testimony, and I forget the name of the woman, you probably know who I'm talking about, who said something to the effect of, my God, we got to protect these labs and make sure that Putin doesn't get these labs. But why were we still concerned about labs in 2022?
Well, it wasn't so much Putin getting them; it was the integrity of the lab being opened up. If I have a lab and I'm testing you to see if what types of COVID you have, or if you have COVID, or if you have a plague, which is a disease that actually exists in the eastern Ukraine, or other diseases. I have samples in my lab of those. If somebody goes and blows up the lab, those samples are everywhere. That's true of a normal lab, and not simply a bioweapons lab. And so I think, in a very inarticulate way, she was expressing, hey, we don't want to have these labs all blown up.
Okay, so just to be clear, these labs, and by the way, should we be using plural or singular? Was it just Kiev, or was there others as far as the former Soviet weapons labs?
Oh, that I can't tell. I can tell you for sure there was a Soviet weapons lab in Kiev when the Soviet Union dissolved, because the leak in that lab is famous. It is not impossible. There were other Soviet bioweapons labs in the Ukraine, but I'm not knowledgeable about them.
And at what point would you say that lab was cleaned up, in the sense of the bioweapons were somehow removed and no longer a concern?
1991 through 1995. That's when the big cleanup occurred in the Ukraine, largely with U.S. money. At the very same time that the Ukraine was surrendering all of its atomic, the Ukraine had the third largest number of nuclear weapons on Earth at the time of the breakup. And of course, the Ukraine, in exchange for guarantees of its territorial integrity, gave up all of its nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and we might want to revisit that, because that's not talked about enough. But one more question on the labs. So why is the U.S. still today, if it is, funding anything going on with biolabs in Ukraine?
Well, I'm sure that there's all kinds of pharmaceutical experiments and so on occurring in the Ukraine and everywhere else in the world. Why would the NIH have experiments in the Ukraine? I'm not aware of what they are, but they aren't nefarious, weaponizing anything. Our problem is not weaponizing anything. Our problem is we're completely defenseless on the other side. Hell, we didn't even have masks, Jim. We don't even have the pharmacology to deal with with biowarfare. We're essentially undefended outside of Fort Meade.
What about this theory that gain of function research that's so controversial now because allegedly was going on in Wuhan, and Fauci denied it or what have you? Some people speculating because that's not allowed in the U.S. Maybe the U.S. is doing that in other places, including Ukraine.
Well, there's no question to understand what it is. If we take it in terms of I'll call it the proton hook that's involved in COVID-19, people in labs developed ways of making viruses much more communicable. So if I'm in a lab and I have 75 mice, I'd like all the mice to get infected all at once, right? And if I if I don't consider the possibility of a leak, that all sounds great. That technology was developed, a lot of it, at the University of North Carolina, and it was sent to Wuhan, China, to the lab at Wuhan. In 2015, we outlawed all gain of function research in the United States, which can be done using a tool called the CRISPR tool. And there's a lot of evidence that nonetheless, the NIH continued to do the research indirectly in Wuhan, China, through funding other companies that went to Wuhan with money. Having said that, I don't think that that was involved directly in the leak of the COVID-19 virus. I do think that the COVID-19 virus leaked from Wuhan, from the military lab at Wuhan. But I don't think our money was responsible for that happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and stay on that for a moment there, because that's a pretty controversial statement. So you call it a military lab. This is the one that everybody is talking about, though?
No.
Or is this a different lab than most people have been talking about as far as a Wuhan lab? Because I understand there's lots of labs in Wuhan.
Wuhan has a whole bunch of labs. It has the lab everybody's talked about, the virology lab. The reason they've talked about it is that a horseshoe bat was in that lab in 2015. And we know that the COVID virus is most closely related in the world to a virus extracted and in that lab in Wuhan. There is a second lab in Wuhan, 2.8 miles away, that is the Wuhan Military Virology Lab. Its job is to weaponize viruses. It is one of 14 such labs identified by the United States government in China. It works closely with the Wuhan lab. I'm going to take just a second to tell you a story if I can.
Okay.
And when I was a little kid, not that little, but in 1977, I got really sick with the flu. It was called the 1977 flu. It went all over the earth. And the thing that perplexed everybody about the 1977 flu was it was exactly the same virus as the 1955 flu, which was called the China flu. A virus can't stay exactly the same. This is like Jim of Northwestern days being Jim of today. It doesn't happen. People mutate, viruses mutate and change. And so when the 77 virus appeared, they said, wait a second, somebody must have kept this virus in a laboratory. Somebody preserved this virus because it is exactly the same as the 55 virus. Chinese said, we have no idea what you're talking about. We don't know anything. In 1994, the head of the virology program in China, his name is in the book and the sources are in the book, said, oh yeah, the 1977 virus, yeah, we preserved the 55 virus, okay? And we were trying to work on a vaccine using our military to develop a vaccine for that virus. And it just got away from us. I'm sorry, during the vaccine test, it just escaped. Now, ponder that for just a second. First, that there was a leak. It went all over the world. It killed millions of people. Second, why would you be doing military tests with a virus? Well, of course, for biowar, to develop a vaccine to a debilitating agent. Understand that the virus exists only in your lab, nowhere else in the world. So exactly the same things happened before. I personally think that it was likely they were developing a vaccine, and in the course of the vaccine, this bug, which is asymptomatic, this virus, just escaped. I don't think they meant for it to. I think that's how COVID-19 occurred. I also think it was the first synthetic virus that's ever affected mankind. All the other viruses we've ever dealt with were natural viruses. This virus is 3.5% different than than the virus that comes out of the horseshoe bat. And we've had, like a hunt they used to call them a shy hunt, the hunt for the non-existent animal for the past 3 years. And no one has ever found the COVID-19 virus in nature. It doesn't exist. So from that, and a great deal of other evidence in my book, The Dancer and the Devil, I deduce and believe that it was leaked out of the Wuhan military lab where it was created.
Mm-hmm. So your primary evidence is the fact that it's has not been found anywhere else, and therefore it must have been essentially man-made?
Well, that's my evidence for the fact it's man-made, that it doesn't exist in nature. My evidence for the fact that it came from the Wuhan lab is it appeared on the doorsteps of the Wuhan lab. I think you and I know res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself.
Right.
I guess the second thing I'd say is they destroyed all the records, the contemporaneous records of infections in Wuhan. The very first thing they did in November and December and January of 2019, 2020 was destroy every single record. The whistleblower who revealed it to the world, he supposedly died of the COVID virus. Now, look, people 36 years old only die of the COVID virus 1.5% of the time. Somehow he suddenly dies, as do all the other people who essentially deal with it in the early stages. I've tried a lot of cases. I tried that case anytime in front of any jury in the world, and I'd win it every single time. I would never lose that case.
So if that's the case, walk us through the state of Chinese vaccines against this virus that you say that they created, and they created it at the same time. They were also creating vaccines to prevent against it, because the idea would be have a vaccine for our people, but not for the enemy, right?
Right. Now, understand, but I don't think that they intended for it to get out. I think it was imperfect at the time it just got out. The problem with this COVID-19 is it's asymptomatic. You can look like you don't have it anymore and still communicate it to other people. They probably didn't know that. But in fact, the vaccines are powerful evidence of what they were doing. It took our pharmaceutical industry from the time this became known in December of 2019 until January 2021, a period of about 13 months, to develop any vaccine. The Chinese army was being vaccinated by May. Within 4 months of the outbreak of this stuff, they had a vaccine. It was a crummy vaccine, Jim, but it was a vaccine. They were vaccinating their own army, and the army unit that they happened to move in, of course, is a bio-war unit. That was the unit that they moved into Wuhan.
Well, that certainly does look suspicious. That like you said, that suddenly the thing's released, and the next thing you know, they're already vaccinating people.
They are bad vaccine. It still is a bad vaccine, which is why they're having terrible problems today in Shanghai, and I guess in Peking too, maybe.
Yeah. Well, is that still the same vaccine that they're using?
They've changed their vaccine from time to modified their vaccine as the COVID virus has mutated. Of course, another terrible thing about this virus is it's mutating, in ways that we really haven't encountered before. In every other virus we've run into, it's always been the same pattern, which is you start off with a fairly deadly virus, not very communicable. It becomes more and more communicable and less deadly. This virus has mutated over and over, where the vaccines we've developed won't work against the new mutation. And that's very unusual, really.
I've been articulating a very simplistic analysis. Tell me if this doesn't make any sense, but I just say, so I got it about a year and a half ago, and very light symptoms. It was basically like having a cold. Wouldn't have even known that I had it, except then I lost smell and taste. And I lost it, pretty significantly. Zero smell, lost 70% of taste, and it lasted for a few weeks. And just from my layman's perspective, like, this is not like anything I've ever heard of before. I mean, how is it that I've lost smell and taste of all things? And it happened 2 days after I recovered from my mild cold. This thing's got to be man-made. Does that make any sense?
That's it. You're dealing with the first, look, we saw the first people go to the moon, right? Well, we're seeing the first man-made virus that's ever affected mankind. And that's sad because it makes it hard to treat it, and means that we don't know as much about it as we would if it were natural. And
you tend to agree with me that those bizarre symptoms point to you to something other than a naturally mutated virus.
That, and plus the ability to carry and communicate it asymptomatically. You can have people that actually have absolutely no symptoms, and they can communicate it to other people.
How unique? You're saying that's a very unique feature of a virus?
Very unusual. Those are both very unusual. And so Yeah, there's a tremendous amount about this virus that's unusual.
So high-level officials in the U.S. government, they presumably know all of what you've just said, and presumably, if they have full access to this information, which I assume they do, they should share your opinion.
Well, it's sad, Jim. When you look at and I'm not trying to criticize Fauci. My criticism is of China, who created the virus. But when you look at them, they actually discussed what are we going to do in February, and the emails say, "Hey, wait, this is pretty bad. If people learn about this, well, they'll become anti-science. They'll become, they'll hate science. They'll hate experimentation." Well, I mean, science, you and I know, is the search for truth. It's not trying to hide from the truth. And to some degree, unfortunately, that's what we've done. We've hidden from the truth. The original medical journal articles were put out by people who were very closely tied to the Chinese government. And they were hardly neutral researchers in any way. The WHO investigation that occurred was only of researchers that China had approved, and they weren't given any of the early forensic records, and they were only allowed to question people in China. Understand, if you're in China and you provide a no where you should provide a yes, there's just no Jim anymore after a week or two.
So the U.S. Intelligence says absolutely there are Chinese bioweapon labs. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a list of them in our book. There's an appendix. We included the actual list of where the bioweapons facilities are, as revealed by U.S. intelligence and the U.S. State Department.
But what's interesting is you have the Fauci types who are mostly still wanting to point it to a wet market leak, which you're saying is really kind of absurd if you look at the virus, that clearly it's man-made in your opinion. And then you have others that say that, well, yeah, maybe they were experimenting with viruses to find vaccines and so on, and it accidentally leaked out, which sounds relatively innocent, but still a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that possibility. But you're taking it one whole other level, that this was an actual bioweapon being developed at a bioweapons lab, and you don't hear anybody in the U.S. government talking about that.
Well, actually, there was a release out of the State Department. It's also an appendix to our book, and they specifically point to the cooperation between the lab at Wuhan, the one that everybody talks about, and the military lab on military projects. The only military projects on viruses are bioweapons. I don't know of any others. But we're kind of in denial. The Russian army right now spends 1 day out of every 5 on bioweapons. That's what they do, 1 day out of every 5. They in hazmat suits and so on. In 2012, in the presidential debate, Putin somebody said that his opponent said, well, you haven't done a good job with the Russian army. They're not up to speed. And Putin said, that's because you don't know about our genetics weapons. I mean, that's what he said. So it doesn't take, you can look in their instance, for example, in Siberia 3 years ago, they had an outbreak of Ebola. Now, Ebola is a tropical disease. How did it get to Siberia? Well, I know how it got to the Urals in Siberia, the same way that that terrible deal occurred in Ekaterinburg. There's a very good book written by a defector named Kenneth Albeck, who defected circa 1999 on the project, on the Russian projects, which are called Project Enzyme. Pre-Putin and pre-Yeltsin, Russia was spending more money on bioweapons projects than it was spending on nuclear weapons. It had 60,000 scientists and engineers working on bioweapons in the Soviet Union, according to Kenneth Albeck, the number 2 guy in the project. It's a wonderful weapon. See, in this sense, if I launch a nuclear weapon and I'm Putin, everybody's going to hit me with a nuclear weapon too. But Jim, if somebody coughs out in Kansas and you lose 70 million people from smallpox, you say, gee, it's unfortunate. you guys haven't been immunizing anybody for smallpox. We started immunizing people 5 years ago in Russia for smallpox. And it's very difficult to trace it. So special weapons, as Putin points out, they're untraceable, and they're a device to escape the nuclear stalemate. That's how both the Chinese and the Russians look at them.
And I presume you would say the U.S. does not have such weapons.
We don't have them. We have at Fort Meade is our limited defense against. We did have them, but in 1972 we signed the Bioweapons Convention, BWC, and we got rid of all offensive weapons. Unfortunately, we got rid of most of our defenses too. So our only defenses are at Fort Meade, our only studies at Fort Meade, and they've been obviously sadly inadequate. I mean, our whole country was brought, to its knees by COVID-19, which is only a debilitating disease. You can imagine what smallpox or what a terrible disease like that would do to our country.
Well, and that takes us back to, the Ukraine labs. And didn't the U.S. want to study what was in these Soviet weapons labs?
Well, I have no doubt we would have wanted to, and I don't have any insights into how we went about looking at it. I know that we allocated money to clean them out to both Russia and to the Ukraine, and I know that in the Ukraine it was used to clean them out. I know that in Russia it was initially used that way. I know that the programs were, according to Albeck and others, were all reinstituted as soon as Putin became the prime minister in 2000.
Mm-hmm. So whether we also studied them or not, you're not sure, but you would certainly say that it would not still be going on today. Your best information is those labs are long gone.
They're long gone. I wish we had studied them. I wish we'd studied them a whole lot more than we apparently did. And I hope we study them now deeply, because I think they pose a tremendous threat, Jim, to the world.
Mm-hmm. So theoretically, we could have a change of administrations here in 3 years. Could be Trump back in, and this information might make the light of day a bit more than it is now. And then the U.S. is going to be faced with, what do we do with China in light of what happened with COVID?
I hope it's not I really deeply hope it's not a Republican Democratic thing. I mean, I even hope it's not an American Russian thing. It's sort of a human being thing. When you begin developing viruses that can kill people and spread, through mankind, you're really talking about an existential threat to man himself. The Chinese in China played with fire. The world is sort of burning, as my book says. That shouldn't be a good thing for the Republicans or a good thing for the Democrats. That should be something that alarms all of us, it seems to me.
And whatever administration reckons with this, what should it do in response to this?
Well, first, we've got to expose it. We've got to expose those biolabs in China, and we've got to expose the biolabs in Russia. And we have defectors. We've had 2 out of the Chinese labs, according to the State Department deal. And we've had defectors out of Russia. And so we have to expose to the world exactly what is happening. Then it seems to me we've got to really get ready. I mean, look, heck, we think of how pitifully we were ready for COVID-19, which was a debilitating disease. Supposedly we were spending $2 billion a year, but we were completely unprepared. Biological weapons in the future represent as much of a threat to us as nuclear weapons do. And we actually need to get our best minds, our greatest doctors, our best people to actually study this and get prepared. What does the United States do if smallpox breaks out and we have a civilization right now that's not immunized? Why don't we have stocks of vaccines prepared? There are all kinds of things we can do.
Well, and I'd like to get into that a little bit, because we've spent so much money and where has it gone? But let's start with deterrence. How do we, certainly our response to COVID isn't going to deter anything in the future, because we haven't done anything to China. We if anything, we've helped cover it up. If anybody dares to suggest it came from a lab, it's Asian hate. So China's off scot-free. So if Russia or China is looking at this and looking at what the U.S. is going to do in the future, they shouldn't be very worried. So what do we need to do to deter it to begin with?
Well, first of all, my opinion is that both Xi and the Russians, or at least the current Russians with Putin, are a tremendous threat to world peace. And I think that they're Stalinists, they're dyed in the wall, and I think we need to start off recognizing that that's exactly what we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, did you say Fauci?
No, I didn't say Fauci. I said Xi and Putin.
Xi and Putin.
And Xi. No, Fauci, I believe. I'm not. I may disagree with Fauci on things, but Fauci's no Xi or Putin. But Putin and Xi are they're very dangerous people. They're driven by Marxism, essentially. They view human beings as just material objects to be used, and their values are very, very different than ours. And they're willing to extract a cost in human lives that would be unthinkable for us. And so you look right now at the Ukraine, at Mariupol, but 20,000 civilians killed in Mariupol so far, estimated. I mean, those are tens of thousands of people that guy has killed. Putin, for what? Why? To liberate people that don't want to be liberated? That desperately want to be free and want to be left alone. You have exactly the same thing in China. So we're living in a bitterly divided world, a very dangerous world, and the recognition of it is the very first thing to do. We've got to start a big bioweapons defensive program in the United States, including the stocking of vaccines and actual better detection programs. We don't even know why on earth we didn't know how to treat this earlier. I have no idea. We were sticking people in ventilators, which killed them, instead of giving them, oxygen through concentrators. So we've kind of got to get our act together a little better than we have, using our very best people to do it.
Mm-hmm. But if we don't take any retaliatory action toward China, any punitive response for what they did, then that's not setting up deterrence very well for the future. Isn't the best thing to deter something similar happening is to show them what we're going to do the last time?
Absolutely. I would adopt serious trade sanctions on China. I would, as quickly as possible, throw large tariffs on China and detach our economy from the Chinese economy. And I would do that as rapidly as I possibly could until there's a change of administrations in China. I represented China many years ago in their first litigation in the United States in the early 1980s. In 1988, they killed the kids in Tiananmen Square, and that was a sea change once that happened. China changed from a country that was becoming slowly really a country you could be proud of and be a friend with, back into its Marxist, Maoist past. And it's continued to go downhill that way ever since 1989 at Tiananmen Square. These are not our friends. These are very dangerous people. Xi's motto, which was also Mao's motto, which comes in turn from the Ming Dynasty, is smile, fill your mouth with honey, and hold a knife next to your heart. And unlike, for example, Trump, who is announcing something every 3 seconds, Xi smiles quietly, and then he takes action that is terribly detrimental, as the book points out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we need to get much tougher with China, and specifically in response to the COVID leak, or even if you don't want to say that we have to prove that leak happened, you're saying intelligence already saying there's many bioweapons labs in China. There ought to be sanctions simply for that alone.
In 2005, China provided bioweapons to Iran, and that's covered in the book. And that's how we learned about the Chinese bioweapons facilities, as nearly as I can tell. And so when we threatened sanctions, they stopped providing bioweapons to Iran. I think that sanctions are a start. Of course, I believe that we should arm, Taiwan so that they can defend themselves. That we should coordinate with our allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia in the Pacific, and we should get ready to defend the Pacific perimeter.
Mm-hmm. And what should we be doing in Ukraine, in your opinion? Have we done enough? And is this what are the U.S. national interests in protecting Ukraine?
Well, I think we made a tremendous mistake in cutting off for a year the supply of Javelin missiles into the Ukraine. We renewed them again just before the Russian attack. We had delivered 350 of them, apparently before the Biden administration took office. They took the position that, look, if we provide them, that'll be a provocation to Putin. That was a terrible miscalculation. Putin, for a long, long time, has had in mind seizing the Ukraine and a great deal else. Having made that mistake, I would arm the Ukraine as fully as I could. The biggest problem that the Ukraine has now is its cities being reduced to ashes by Russian artillery. I would give them so many drones, so many of our best drones, that they would be like mosquitoes blowing the Russians away every time those Russian artillery units got started.
And to be clear, why would you be so aggressively helping Ukraine defend itself?
Because I think it's our fight. We're not allied with them. I'm not in favor of sending kids to die in the Ukraine. But look, our country stands for human freedom. Those are people bravely fighting for their freedom, for their own country. The reason they're fighting so bravely, as you know, is they've done this before. They were conquered by the Russians in the 19 teens. They lost somewhere between 4 and 8 million people in the 1930s to Stalin. Putin's grandfather was Stalin's cook. His father was an exterminator in the Ukraine during World War II. And so they've seen it all before and they don't want to be enslaved again. And so I would be willing to do anything for them except send American troops there.
Mm-hmm. And you also are, it's not just a supporting freedom and independence and so on. You also think there's geopolitical, strategic reasons we should be concerned about Russia taking over Ukraine?
Yes, I think that the withdrawal out of Afghanistan was a disaster for the credibility of American foreign policy. It was incredibly demoralizing for people in the military, of whom I have a number of relatives. It was horrifying to sit in Kabul and see people presenting little babies and you couldn't help them, right? And then to do a bailout and leaving them behind. I think that was terribly debilitating. I think that if we allow Putin to crush the Ukraine, a free country, the Ukraine, that although not our allies, at least have been our friends, I think we make a terrible mistake. I think that we go back to Hitler's march ultimately into Czechoslovakia, Austria, the sequence Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and finally Poland.
Yeah, one of the lessons from World War II seems to be when you've got a tyrant who's got territorial ambitions and is invading sovereign neighbors, you kind of nip that in the bud sooner rather than later.
Well, he becomes a hero otherwise. Putin conquering the Ukraine and marching through Kiev, and so on becomes, he is like Hitler. Normal people somehow think that this, I guess Gorky described it best of all. Gorky was describing Stalin once upon a time in his diary, and he said Stalin is a flea magnified by propaganda into a fearsome creature. Well, that's who Putin is. Putin is a flea, and if you allow him to be magnified by a victory in the Ukraine, he will become a truly fearsome creature.
Let's talk a little bit about Putin and Stalin, because I think you're making the point that Putin is Stalin, that he idolizes Stalin, and that in fact, even I've been hearing that Stalin is having some reemergence in Russia as far as people starting to rethink him as a great leader.
He's on the side of buses in Russia right now in Moscow. They put him on the side of buses. Putin has said over and over again, Stalin is a great man who's just been misunderstood. He got a little bit of bad advice from bad subordinates, but basically he was a wonderful man. As I said, Putin's career is closely tied to Stalin, his grandfather, his father. both tied up with Stalin and the KGB. He said, chip off the old KGB bloc. That's who Putin actually is. He mourns the loss of the Soviet Union. He told the patriarchs in the Russian Orthodox Church, which is a classic state church, not a church like you and I would think of. He told them that they should make Lenin and Stalin saints of the church. Lenin and Stalin killed 175,000 priests, Orthodox priests, and they're saints of the church. When he first was elected, Jim, his mentor was a guy named Slobok, and Slobok had been the mayor of St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. And he was asked, who is Stalin? And Stalin and Slobok said, who is Putin? Slobok said, Putin is the new Stalin. 2 days later, he was dead with a heart attack, and both of his bodyguards had three simultaneous heart attacks. That's Putin. Putin is, just as Slobok said, the new Stalin, and he is, just as Slobok's death shown, a new poisoner.
And for the Russian people, they seem to be going along with this.
I don't know. I was looking at, of course, thousands and thousands of demonstrators in Russia are rotting in some gulag. And we know what they think because they were protesting until they were picked up by the secret police and taken away.
And by the way, it's your understanding they have not been released yet?
Some have not been released, no question. Some have disappeared. There are any number of people in both China and Russia that get picked up and they're never found again. They never appear again. There's in China, for example, a pastor named Wang Yi had an entire church called the Early Rain Church. There were 82 different parishioners that were picked up who have just disappeared. Nobody knows what ever happened to them. They're gone. They're probably somebody else's kidney, the way organs are harvested in China. In terms of Russia, there are any number of people. The most famous of the people who are in prison right now is Navalny. Navalny was the primary electoral opponent to Putin. He was poisoned with Novichok, which is a Soviet defense poison. He almost died. He was taken to Germany, and he was treated and actually survived. Bravely went back to Russia. He was immediately arrested in Russia for violating his parole by going to Germany to be cured. And he's now been given 15 additional years. So he's in for a term of 17 years, in effect, a death sentence for opposing Putin. There are any number who have just disappeared.
Yeah. My guest last week said that she considers Putin to be very safe in his positions. That hope for some type of ouster is not likely to happen, and we're likely to be looking at Putin in that position for decades to come.
That's what they said about Stalin. In 1953, Stalin was likely planning, and was certainly planning a purge of his underlings. And, of course, in Russia, 7 different oligarchs have supposedly committed suicide in the last 2 weeks. The last one, was in Spain.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry. Say that again. We're talking about present day?
Present day, in the last 2 weeks, 7 different oligarchs, 7 of them, have committed suicide in Russia. High-ranking, wealthy people.
Wow. 7 of them. I wasn't aware of that.
In Spain, the guy who was the number 2 guy in their oil company was found in his villa in Spain. He was hung, and his wife and child were chopped to pieces near him. The knife and the axe had been wiped clean, and they claimed, wait, it's a suicide, strange suicide, and very coincidental suicide. So he's got problems, and he knows he has problems. That's why he sits so far from everybody. But he should take lesson from Stalin. Stalin was in 1953, was likely planning a nuclear attack on the West ultimately, but planning immediately a purge. And so Beria, his number two guy, poisoned Stalin with warfarin. Understand, Stalin's got tasters. One of them was Putin's father, and he's surrounded by guards. Warfarin is the deal we use for rat poison. It's a blood thinner, and so they fed Stalin blood thinner, and he bled to death. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because Molotov's autobiography says so, Khrushchev's autobiography says so, and Beria confessed to killing him at his own trial. When Stalin was unconscious and so on, Beria brought in the doctors. Do you know what they did, Jim? They applied leeches. Now, that really helps a guy who's bleeding to death in the stomach, doesn't it? And then Stalin died in front of his daughter, Svetlana. And Svetlana described how he died. He sat there waving his arms, screaming like the angel of death was coming to pick him up. So if you ask me, Putin looks a little nervous these days, and I wouldn't think he was sitting quite so secure. And if he has security, he's surrounded. Half the people around him hate him, as do a large number of the people in Russia. He's got any number of people in prison. That isn't because, he's a democratic ruler. I guess he has to sleep at night knowing about the thousands and thousands of people he's killed in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of his, what appears to be a major miscalculation in Ukraine? I don't know what he thought was going to happen there, that they were going to be welcome as liberators, but clearly there's no support for in Ukraine to become a client state of Russia.
Amazing. Hubris is an amazing thing, isn't it? And I guess if you're an absolute dictator, you never have anybody to say no or you're wrong. And that seems to be what has happened to him. Of course, he denies any miscalculation, says the whole deal is on schedule, and of course, he denies killing any civilians in Mariupol, or all those bodies in Bucha, that were on the road into Kiev, whom he claims were all planted by the Ukrainians. So there doesn't seem to be any truth to a guy like Putin. No, he's made a tremendous miscalculation, I think, in the Ukraine. The question is, what will he do to correct it? Will he continue with this madness, or will he use biological or chemical warfare, or will he actually go to, tactical nuclear weapons? And the answer is we don't know for sure.
As to bioweapons, when do you believe he has used them in the past? When and where?
Bioweapons? Well, he certainly provided bioweapons to the Iraqis, to the Hussein regime. In terms of his own use of bioweapons, he hasn't used them, as far as I know. So far, he hasn't used them. They've leaked, but I have no knowledge that he has actually used them. He has used poisons like Novichok, polonium, 210, and so on to poison a large number of people. That he used effectively weapons prohibited by the Biowarfare Convention in the theater incident involving Chechens in Russia. You remember the theater that was taken over by Chechens roughly 2011. They gassed the theater. They walked in and about half the people were dead. That was the use of a lethal gas prohibited by the Geneva Convention since 1933. So that's what he's done, but he hasn't cut loose biological weapons so far, that, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm. But no doubt he has them, and the more desperate things become in Ukraine, the more likely he is to use them, and presumably it would be more likely than nuclear, as you point out, because it's not as likely to get the retaliatory response.
Well, he's had a terrible problem in Mariupol, the little city which is right on the eastern border of the Ukraine, a wonderful little city. And it's a city of about 500,000. He went in with 28,000 troops. It was defended essentially by 2,700 Marines. They fell back finally under a steel plant, which is where they're still surviving right now. They've reported that there were chemicals being sprayed on them. The Russians have denied using biological or chemical weapons and say that these were simply special weapons. Now, I'm not sure what a special weapon is. I guess if I'm a Marine and I'm underground and somebody's pouring something on me, it's a distinction without a difference.
It's a special weapon for a special operation.
It's a special, they say that they're going to gas them out like moles. That's what the Russians say.
Hopefully the U.S. does what you're suggesting, which is do everything we can to further arm Ukraine and deal Putin major defeat that keeps his tail between his legs for as long as possible.
Well, we've got to hope and pray, even just as human beings, we'd have to do that absent any political calculations. But in fact, it's very strongly in our own best interest. It's a tremendous mistake to let tyrants overrun peoples who are trying to be free.
Yeah. Well, not to mention, to bring it back to that nuclear arms deal, the U.S. was a signatory to that deal whereby Ukraine voluntarily gave up nuclear weapons. If they hadn't done that, I don't think this invasion would have ever happened. Ukraine gives up the nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial integrity, and everybody's going to respect their current borders, including the U.S. and Russia.
Exactly. That was the 1994 agreement, which seems to have been honored more in passing. Of course, the Russians immediately claimed that they're no longer bound by it. Putin's not bound by anything. And the United States was, initially was longer on rides than providing bullets, as Zelensky said. Now we seem to be actually arming them, hopefully with the best and most arms we can get to them as quickly as possible.
Yeah. But it sounds like you agree with me that we ought to be talking about that agreement more often as far as the U.S. having an obligation here. The U.S. benefits from having fewer nations with nuclear weapons, arguably. So we were a beneficiary of that agreement, and now we need to live up to it.
If we don't live up to that, if we really let them go under, how long do you think it's going to be till the Japanese get nuclear weapons, or the Australians, or the Indians already have them, or Saudi Arabia? If you can't rely on the United States and its treaty obligations, while you arm yourself to the teeth, and then you look at a world where everybody has nuclear weapons.
Thank you again to John O'Neill. You can check out his book, The Dancer and the Devil, Stalin, Pavlova, and the Road to the Great Pandemic, wherever you buy your books. And thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.